Okay, and hopefully this works out there. This is going out on just Substack. We've actually got another feed that we're trying to do with the internal group on that, and then the legend the legendary group that's in actually a couple states that kind of signed up and they wanted their own kind of private pipeline chat outside of Substack. So we kind of set that up. So we'll see how well that works here. If you guys are seeing this and it looks like you are, just send me a little text message. Don't call, but send a text message and let me know how that goes. All right. So today, what we're going to be doing, it's August 21st, 2025, Thursday. We actually have some time. It's been a while since we did a live stream, but as everyone knows, or most people know, we're very busy here. We have the Historical Detective Agency as kind of our side hustle or our side gig, if you will. The primary, we have a number of investigators. I'm currently now a private investigator, but prior to that was a military and government investigator and then kind of a consultant overseas in Southeast Asia, working on being able to look at various things. And the reason that we've got to bring this up as a background is because looking at historical cases, there's a lot of technique that we use in the evidence-based approach for real-world cases that we've noticed gets lost in the study of history. There's some things there, but the academic-based approach or kind of the popular history-based approach to history is kind of selling something, right? So in other words, what you do is we actually find you lose a lot of the information that you could get if you just took an evidence-based approach to the subject, and reducing those biases are critical. Now, why do I say that? What the case of Prester John is, and this kind of came up, there was another Substack post that was very fascinating talking about it. And it would seem to be a good illustration about how you can take even something that's proven to be a myth. And in that myth, you can find out there's a lot of other truths around it, and it reveals a lot of other facts, a lot of other truths, situations around that myth about what people talk about. This holds true in normal investigations when you're eliciting information or interviewing a witness or a subject. You find that even if they're lying, even if they're telling you a story that is not based in fact, the way that they present the evidence sometimes provides what we call projection. They're telling you a story that they want to believe, either about themselves or about the other person. And that in itself can be revealing. So the stories that people tell have a purpose, and you can't just, you shouldn't just discount them. They're not factual. You're not going to prosecute anybody or create targeting packages based on it. But what it does is it allows you to kind of see beyond what they're trying to tell you, and then revealing either what they're trying to hide or what they're trying to emphasize, but they're transferring it. And hopefully that'll make more sense as we kind of go along here. Of course, if anybody has questions, this is for the Substack group only. We're going to start focusing on Substack, and go ahead and write the questions. We'll get to them as they are. If questions come up, just pop up the questions right there in the chat, and they should feed into the system here so we can go ahead and answer them. What we're talking about today is Prester John, and the legend of Prester John is interesting because it highlights, again, just like someone that's telling you a story, if you're interviewing them or eliciting information from you, it tells a lot about the world around the story of Prester John, and not just in Europe, not just in the area of the immediate Crusades, but well beyond it. And it's a very good lesson in what was actually going on at the time, and how even some historians today will look back at the legend of Prester John and go, look how unsophisticated they are. They believe these legends, and they'll perpetuate their own legends in it, even as they're doing it, even as they're kind of, putting down the people of yesteryear for believing in Prester John. They're actually perpetuating very similar legend types today with their own myths in what they reveal or obscure in their historical presentations. So what we're going to do today, as best we can, is go over real brief the legend of Prester John, and then we're going to dig deep. We're going to kind of peel back what was the evidence, the actual evidence that people were using to build off of that legend, because there's the rumors and the legend, but you always want to dig down to the source, right? Just like in a pandemic, you want to dig down to the source. Okay, who's the zero patient, right? In any giant crime, any giant incident, you want to kind of dial down to who's an actual witness, who saw it, and what's the evidence that you made this decision, because speech, ideas, like anything else, get legs and they kind of run on their own. So you want to dial down to those source documents, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And in this one, they're pretty sparse. So we're going to bring in a couple of other documents that will help us. There's secondary sources, tertiary sources that will kind of help put the context on it. So actually, I'll go into those first before we dig into it. one of the things that we're going to be looking at today that I always recommend anytime you look at any historical evidence or any historical subject is get a long view, right? Don't just kind of dial in on the specificity, the specificity of it in time. Get a long view. What happened before it? What happened afterward? And going back, this is for the group in the interstate group that's doing both real world investigations and historical investigations. What this is when you come to a witness and you ask a witness a question, when they start the story is what they want to tell you, right? So in other words, if it's let's say a domestic violence and person A says, that person B just came up and hit me. Okay, well, what happened before that, right? So dialing it back will give you a different answer about what was going on, right? It sets the story differently. So where I begin a conversation can completely change that subject of the conversation, can completely change that narrative about the way you do it. The same in history. You want to be able to, here's the event that we're talking about. Here's kind of the bracketing usually of the event that we talk about. But I usually like to really dial it back and see, okay, well, what happened before that? Let's go back. And you could go back all the way to Rome. My dad used to always go back to Rome. Everything led back to Rome, or the dinosaurs. but reasonably, you can kind of go back and see what other factors led up to the events that you're looking at in the terms of centuries. The French have a good term for it, longue durée. It's actually a school of thought and history that tries to take in much longer durée to see really what kind of developed the situation that you're looking at. And when we're talking history and civilizations, you're talking in some cases centuries. In addition, you want to be able to geographically kind of widen your lens. So sometimes people look at a city and what's going on in that city or that state or that nation, and that's all they see. And the reality is that the influences on any organization are well beyond the actual borders of that organization. Yeah, there's a lot going on within my body, but outside of my physical body, there's a lot that influences what's happening, right? Even stress. I'm getting mentally stressed. My body itself will go through a reaction. So understanding that in history is very important. And one of the ways that we can do it, it's a big honking book, but it's great. It's the Timetables of History. You'll probably find something similar. You don't have to get this one. This one's actually quite old. It's translated, I believe, from German, actually. And so being it's a little bit older, the ancient history has a lot of gaps that are now filled in. But I like that because it allows us to kind of fill in the gaps where we need it. And as an example of that, we're looking at this period of time for the legend of Prester John. And you can see there's a lot of gaps. But what it does is it breaks it down. Actually, I'm going to do this over here on the presenter. I'm going to add this to stage, see if that'll work. And let's try this. Nope. Bear with me 1 second here. There we go. Okay, so going over into the categories that it has, it's nice because you can kind of focus in on what were the influences that were going on at the time. And a lot of times people will stick to this column only. They only look at politics, right? And that's the only thing that they look at. But what influences, of course, is literature. What is going on in the fictional realm? Many times people can't differentiate between fiction and fact. And if they read a fiction, it blurs the lines and you begin to believe it. And you'll see that with Prester John. There's some fictional events that come in. People can't differentiate fiction from reality, and it affects them. Even if they know it's fiction, they have an emotional reaction to what they've just seen. That's why in today's world, a lot of times when you're interviewing witnesses and people of interest, you'll find that there's a lot of information that they'll provide that's more grounded in something they've seen in the media or an emotional context that the media has built up, and they respond to that. All right. So that's kind of interesting. So politics is one, but media and literature is important. What did they read? What were people around that time reading? What was their myth cycle? What was kind of that cultural context by which these people made their decisions? And then it goes into religion, the same thing, visual arts, music, scientific and technical. Did they have the capability, the means, mode of opportunity, and then kind of daily life, right? So did farming increase, right? Were people now wearing shoes? That sort of thing kind of goes into the context of when you're studying history. When you do these deep dives, you want to be able to kind of go in length, in time, and geography to really understand what's going on. And a book like this is one way to kind of at least get the boundaries, at least get some context of kind of a macro sense, and then you can dial in a little bit deeper. And actually, this one goes a little bit further forward. Now, again, this is very sparse, kind of in the era. As you see, it gets a lot more granular, a lot more detailed as we come into the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. But that's beyond the reach of Prester John. but not as much space to fill in. And we're actually working on a document right now, a little bit with AI to help out in being able to populate our own document that you can access looking up. We'll probably have that over on Obsidian if the group in those states right now, the Centurion group wants to be able to look at it. We'll probably have that fixed up for you. But again, a nice, big timetable of history is actually pretty good. One that just leaves it out there. Doesn't add a lot of opinion into it. It just presents straight facts, but it helps you be able to contextualize what you're looking at with any subject. Now, the second we're going to look at, I love this book. There's a couple of books that just you wouldn't think would hit, but they do. And that is this one. There's another one, The History of the World in I think 7 drinks, where it shows, how did tea change the world? How did beer change the world? And sometimes it's a small thing that occurs. I know a lot of people out there go, beer's not a small thing, but it will show how some things change society. This one, though, A History of the World in 12 Maps by Jeremy Broughton, it shows how maps were used, not just in understanding the physical maps, the geographical lines, if you will, of what it was, like a top-down view, but it shows the mind map. People were putting what they believe the world to be in this map, and there was historical maps, it was religious maps. And for example, he has a Thai map, which is kind of the Buddhist route to reincarnation, or good dharma, and that process is a map, and it looks like physical. So if you didn't know a lot about at the time Siam, if you didn't know a lot about Siamese thought, you would think that this map to kind of the better world is a physical map, and you try to look on it. No, it looks like a physical map, but it's basically the way that you get a better life, that you move up by doing good dharma and that sort of thing. So a good bun, as the Thais call it. But what he does is it's also in the West. So Mappa Mundi. So the time of Prester John, the West would have Mappa Mundi, and even things like orientation, like when did we start pointing up as north on a map? When did we begin to orient the world where north is up? Prior to that, in some cultures, north would be south, up is down, left is right, right? So that orientation period reflects a certain philosophy. And at certain times in certain cultures, the up of a map would be Jerusalem, or the center of a map would be Jerusalem. For the Christian kingdoms, Jerusalem was central to their world. And so a lot of times it would either be in the center, and in fact, in some cases, even if it's in the West, England, for example, would be left out or minimized as like a very small island because it wasn't important. It's not the geography, it's the internal mental map, it's the internal spiritual map, it's the internal political map that they'll reflect into how they orient a map, what they emphasize, what they don't emphasize, and what they put in there. And so this is fascinating for that time period in a couple of ways. Number one, it shows how they saw the world both in the period of time for Prester John legends and the area of where the Prester John legends were supposed to take place, what they understood of the world beyond. And this is a good example here. So, here we have England up here, we have Italy, here's the Mediterranean, here's Africa, right, which is up. But again, Jerusalem is central to the Christian map. But they were aware of lands beyond. They were aware of what we now call Asia. They were aware of Asia. Asia for them was here, but this is kind of the American Asia. Most of you are in America, and they were aware of the lands beyond it in India. And that's also important to note, is that there was tremendous trading going on with, this is the Mappa Mundi. That's fascinating. This is the important to understand how they saw the world as well, their relationship in space and their relationship in politics and religion especially was very, very important. So this is another excellent book to kind of look at how maps can tell you a lot more than just, well, here's a river, here's a mountain. It's the mind of the peoples at the time that was going through there. That's very important. And to kind of illustrate that, even in today, so we kind of go, well, we're more sophisticated today to some degrees, maybe. But even in a Mercator projection, as this map points out, the ratio, right? So when you flatten a 3D object out to 2 dimensions, you're changing ratios, right? So in historical, even then, we're looking at some countries look bigger than others, right? Why again do we point north as up, right? There's no up in space. So why do we do that? But this one's interesting to me. And this has a direct relation to the Prester John story. And it has to deal with how we still see Persia, how we see the Persian Empire, which became the same landlines, those same geographical boundaries, eventually became the Seljuk Turks, right? The Islamic world that kind of took over from the West. They saw it as the Islamic world. They didn't see all the differentiations of the different groups in there. But the Persian Empire became eventually roughly the lines that were the Seljuk Empire that moved around here. The Islamic world that also included the Hajjaj moving down here into Yemen. But they kind of ended. It's the end of the Near East, and it doesn't show India. This is also an important point. Most of the other maps, when you're dealing in other regions, they'll show the nations around it. They label them and they kind of continue it, so it places it within context. If you look at most depictions in the West of Persia, of the Near East and basically the Near East and what they called the Orient or Asia, you're looking around this area, they kind of ended. But people, and what that does is in your mind, it doesn't place it within context of a much larger world that it's now tapped into right next to what's now India, what's now the Uyghurs, Xinjiang, Tibet, China, Mongolia, Siberia, that it was basically they had tapped into. If you just cross this, you tap into a much larger world, and it was just one empire separated. And the Persians, as we'll find out, have a tremendous road network. That's what Alexander the Great used to kind of go through, and he conquered it because it was a very easy road. Herodotus wrote about the trade routes that were in Persia. So the Greek historian Herodotus, when he traveled through, and these were all weather roads. So this was very easy to travel, and this was trade. And a lot of what was going on here during the Crusades, during the period of Prester John, had to deal with, of course, the profit that you're going to make on all those delicious spices and all those amazing ivory, wood, exotic woods, materials that are coming through, even alchemical ingredients that I found out coming through to hit these ports, where the three oligarchs that are up here had basically the kind of the charters, the permission by the Byzantines to kind of come get and to be able to trade on those, and it went back up into Europe. So this is really very important for trade. It's routes and resources as much as it is religion. Religion was the motivator that got a lot of people focused in on it, but what sustained it and what got the leadership, the oligarchs, on board with it was the money, the profit, right? The routes and resources that they would be able to access by getting another foothold in here, just as the Romans had, just as the Byzantine Empire had, until they were knocked out in the 700s by the Islamic movement that kind of came through. And this was a return. So we'll have to go into that. Let me point another map, and we're going to go into the history of it. But even here, even today, by not showing clearly that this is India, that we're now tapped into the large Indian empire that Ashoka was building up, right? Ashoka, the famous Indian king, emperor, right after Alexander the Great had passed. You have this resurgence of a giant, basically a Buddhist empire, right under Ashoka. And that went here. They had Buddhist missionaries that worked all the way apparently to Tripoli. So they have an account of one that went all the way to Tripoli. So there was mass movement that went on here. And, the Rudyard Kipling, the East is East, the West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Well, it wasn't physical, right? There was a lot of trade going on, and it didn't start when the Mongols hit. It was there during the Persian Empire, because Rome, a lot of the tax dollars from Rome and the Roman Empire were actually on trade goods that were coming from India over and through the Persian Empire, right? So this region here, there were spices even from Jakarta that were making it up into the Roman Empire. This trade network was very, very good. Benjamin, there's a Jewish trader called Benjamin, right? So he moved around and he did a lot of trading, and then he eventually moved along the routes, and he wrote a historical account of it. So initially he was from Spain, and then he came through and he followed some of the routes into basically what's now Afghanistan. He went down into the Hijaz, he went down Saudi Arabia, the Gulf area, and then he ended up in Egypt, what's now Egypt. So he did a pretty good route, and I'll show you that one to show you what was known at the time. Let's see if we can get his trade route up here. All right, be just 1 second. But showing one of the things that he did, what's important about this is that he was able to write about the trade routes in the area aren't just land. This is another misnomer that we have. We think a camel, moving along that area. We think all of these sorts of things. No, the actual, well, I'll have to get that later. We'll put it up in the article. But one of the things is that the trade routes, and again, this one doesn't show. In 8 days, you could go from a port, what's now the Gulf states here next to Saudi Arabia, and you would be able to go to India, one of the major trading ports in India, and back in 8 days. You could go further than that if you follow the monsoons. The Indian, what's now the Indian, but the Ashokan Empire, that area was able to move ships. They actually made ships that were able to take advantage of those large monsoons, and they would get ahead of that curve, that wind curve, and basically move the tides, the currents and the wind, and they had tremendous trade routes on the water that were rather rapid. Again, you're going from Saudi Arabia here in 8 days, and basically less than a month to a month, depending, you could be up here trading with basically the Christian traders in the Christian worlds, in which case one of the oligarch trading houses within Italy, the Genovese, the Venetians, and the Pisanos, you could move up in here, and then very short order, it's in England, Germany, Scandinavia, Sweden, all of these areas up here. Of course, they weren't there at those times, but those are the kingdoms that they were in. All of that movement could occur within 3-4 months, in some cases less, depending on how fast they were able to get here and how quickly they could get caravans organized up there, and as long as they didn't encounter trouble en route. So this is a vibrant trade network, but you lose it when you kind of say here, and then the end of the ancient Near East almost implies it was over, but it wasn't. Remember, Persia took over some of the Byzantine area. They took over the Holy Land towards the end of the kind of the 5th and 6th, 7th century. Rome, the Byzantines, began to retreat back in power, and that was kind of moved over by a resurgent Persian Empire had kind of taken over. And then, of course, the Arabs here, basically it was an Arab revolt with Muhammad, created a larger revolt within initially the Persian Empire, and then it expanded outside of the borders of the Persian Empire. But it was still there. So it wasn't an end. So even today, even with a lot of the maps that we have today, it still biases to some degree what you're going to see. And that's important because of something I'm going to talk about now real quick for the folks down there at the Centurion group. It is something called the Baader-Meinhof syndrome. Now, people my age will probably remember the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. It's a terrorist group. But Baader-Meinhof syndrome is actually what we used to call the bias syndrome, or kind of the bias. Basically, it's a preference bias. And what you're exposed to, what you see most often, what you will hear in news accounts all the time, you're going to be biased toward that. And to give you an example that when we trained on it, they kind of taught us about it. There's a ball pit. So imagine a giant ball pit. All the colors of the balls are there. And when you look at it initially, if you don't have any biases, you're going to see basically the random sampling of whatever color comes up. But if you leave that, if prior to seeing it, you are told that, hey, clown noses are big red balls. Hey, in the clowns, they have those big buttons, they're big balls in there. The red balls. Wow, look at those stoplights. They're, in other words, you're prefacing it. You're beginning to plant the seeds of a cultural bias, if that's always what you're exposed to, either in news or music, in advertisements. Everything around you kind of influences your mind. And so if you see all this information, so there's red balls everywhere, when you go back into that ball pit, nothing has changed except your perception bias. And you will see that suddenly there's more red balls in here, right? The other colors have diminished. There's more red balls in here. And that's called the Baader-Meinhof syndrome. So I'd recommend people kind of look that up, because that happens. It does occur everyday life. You're going to be exposed to it no matter what. You're going to see more certain cars on the road, even though statistically it may not reflect it. It may be the opposite. You're just noticing it more, right? That's basically what it is. You're just keyed in. You're sensitive to that, so you're going to notice that more. And that occurs in history. People look at, no, there's the name. That must be it. So you have to kind of balance that bias out to be careful about it. And maps will do that, because they set your preference for seeing the world in a certain way, so that when you are presented with a large information, you're still going to focus in on one geographic area or one specific timeline or one group, versus, okay, let's take this all into totality and then kind of actually measure means, mode of opportunity, and what resources they actually had, and things like that. You'll see it a lot in different things, so we won't go into that too much, but here we go. Now, going into today, so the story of Prester John, that kind of gives the context. Oh, one more book. Actually, we'll do this later. Okay. So the story of Prester John, for those that don't know, the context of where this myth came up, as I said before, the Persian Empire and the East and the West, if we want to call it that, had been interacting for a very long time. Most people think that the Persia only existed because to fight against the Spartans, right? So, the legend of 300, the Persians are those weird, evil guys over there, and they fight the Greeks. Because we have mostly Greek in our initial Western history, it's mostly Greek and then Romans that had kind of copied the Greeks' legends about what's going on. And so you see it from that viewpoint. But now we have kind of a larger viewpoint about those things. We were able to translate a lot of the materials from different groups, not just the Persians, but around them. So you could have the Assyrians. The Assyrians actually they're still there today. There's Assyrian Christians that still were in between Iran, Iraq, down into Lebanon, Syria. They're still there today. In fact, they just had a genocide, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years. Daesh tried to wipe them out, so it's pretty bad. But they're there today. But they've been there since the Assyrian Empire, and they existed through the Persian Empire, through the Seljuk Empire, and they've been a people that's just kind of wandering around in the middle there. And they converted to Christianity very early, which actually plays into the Prester John story. So, looking at the interchange, you had the Greeks were interchanging with that. Alexander the Great basically took over the Persian Empire. So he moved through there and he presented himself as the next generation of Persian leader. He dressed as a Persian. He took on the Persian airs. That upset a lot of his Macedonian soldiers and some of his sub-commanders, but he presented himself with it. Now, he died, of course, in Baghdad, but in his Seleucus, or the Seleucid Empire, was one of his generals, Seleucus, and he was able to kind of manage that and continue the Persian Empire using the Persian methods, right? So do we call that, if this was Asian history, then people would say, well, that's just another Persian dynasty, right? So the Seleucid Empire is another Persian dynasty. Whereas in the West, we say, no, that's the Greeks, and that's a that's a Greek dynasty, or that's an Alexandrian, a Macedonian dynasty. So it's kind of interesting how we do that. But whatever it is, it's a hybrid, because the Greco, at that time, the Hellenic world, was interchanging and interacting with the Persian world. And in that, there was a lot of mixing that was going on. And then it went into contact with India, because Persia went into what's now India, and Asok was going up there, and then the Buddhists were moving in there. And you can actually see where, for example, the cult of Apollo was mixing with Buddhist thought. And there is some evidence to say that the imagery of Buddha, because before they would not do how are you going to do Buddha? You're not going to do it. They weren't doing images of Buddha until they were beginning to compete, so to speak, in the mind space of the Hellenic world that was coming in with the Apollo, the religion that worshipped Apollo, and they had the statues. And so the early statues of Buddha looked suspiciously like the Greek statues of Apollo that were kind of floating around there. Even in later dynasties in India, they were issuing edicts, royal court orders, in multiple languages, including Greek. There were areas in the Indian world that still spoke Hellenic, right? Essentially Greek. And they would have to write in Greek letters in order to communicate that with them. Of course, over time that went away, but that shows the level of communication that was going on and the interchange of ideas that was occurring. Now, fast forward to the Roman world. The Rome took over, and they again were pushing back against the Persian Empire, and they pushed back, and then they had what's now what we consider the Holy Land. But the Romans were there famously. The Christians understand this because, and the Jews understand it, because there was the occupation of Judea. The Hasmonean dynasty in Judea was a Jewish dynasty, and they were initially had sought out the Romans, and then various degrees they rebelled against the Romans. And so what happened was over time, the Romans had moved more and more into that area. They took over Egypt, and that area was Rome for a very long time. After probably about 400 or 500 years, as Rome changed, Rome began to morph, the Persians became back in. And even though the official religion of Persia is Zoroastrianism, right, they would allow the Christians and the Jews to remain, and there they stayed. So you had this melange of kind of monotheism. You had Zoroastrianism, you had Judaism and all its branches, and you had Christianity in all its branches. And it moved throughout the Persian Empire, right? It wasn't a stop. In fact, some of the Jews in Babylon had never returned once Judea was made. They stayed there. They stayed in Babylon. They never left. And so you see groups that would move throughout the Persian Empire, Christians, Jews, and you would see Jews and Christians, of course, move throughout the Roman Empire. So there's this tremendous movement and an occasion separation of doctrine. In 52 AD, St. Thomas, who was reputedly one of the disciples of Jesus, went and he wrote the Gospel of St. Thomas, and he was in India, and he was converting. He was in India, and he was converting people to Christianity. So how is this possible? Well, if you knew the trade routes, it's not that far off, right? You just travel through the Persian areas. At various times, the kingdom of Judea was under Persia, or it was under the Seleucids, or it was under the Romans, and it was kind of that middle area that was contested a lot, and it was easy to trade with both of them. You cross over here, you go and you follow the huge trade network, or you go to Rome, which now has a bunch of nice roads, and you can go anywhere within the empire pretty easily. So there was a lot of interchange of ideas as well as goods and people. So St. Thomas goes over, and within the Christian understanding, there is a group in the East that has converted. This is known. But sometimes they would compete. There were Mazdians and Nestorians. They were known as Mazdians, and Nestorians were the two biggest ones. And they that was the legend within the Christianity. They understood that it was in the Gospel of St. Thomas, and it was from the time of that Jesus lived. It was actually one of his disciples that ended up going over there. It was also within there that the Assyrians had converted, most of the Assyrians converted to Christianity. So you had a large Christian group in the Persian Empire to that direction. Now, of course, in 600 and 700, when basically an Arab revolt occurs or an Arab invasion occurs, Muhammad leads it, and now it begins to develop this religion called Islam, and that moves into the Persian Empire, quickly takes over the Persian Empire, and then pushes back the Christian Byzantines as far back as they can go. But the Persians had taken over some of them in what's Judea or Palestina at that time, because Rome had changed the name, and that's where they go. And so at that point, from about 700 AD onward, you have the Holy Land, as the Christians know it, in the hands of now Islam, and that began kind of a long period of friction between the two, but it was really along the same old lines that Persia and Greece, that Persia and Rome had encountered. This was the same dynamic that was occurring because routes and resources were in contention. When trade was good and everyone profited, there was peace. When those profits started to go down, then there ended up being war. To give an example, the pilgrims were allowed to move into Jerusalem. They were allowed to continue. Christians had a huge pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was the central city for Christianity. Most people today wouldn't recognize that, which is interesting. But historically, when you look, Jerusalem is absolutely a key city for the Christian consciousness. It was a huge pilgrimage city. And during 1097 to 1099, because of the harassment of, initially before 1097, the harassment of the pilgrims, the Pope launched the First Crusade. And in 1099, the city of Jerusalem was captured, and they moved north to link up with large Abyssinian Christian areas in Edessa, which is now Urfa, Turkey. So as far north as Turkey, you have this giant movement of return, so to speak, of the Christians, this time led by the Roman Catholic Church versus the Byzantines. And I've actually got a little map here that should help out just so everybody can see it. There we go. So you can kind of see, whoops, let me get this. There we go. So you can see now where that begins to move in. So you have the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire. Remember, they had split. So there was the kind of the Eastern Christian group and the Western Christian group, called by different names, but that's essentially what it was. Rome split into two empires, and they were frenemies. It is a good word for it. But you see there that yellow is basically the kingdom of Jerusalem, but they had linked up with existing Christian groups up there. And the important one is Edessa, Edessa, which is now Urfa, Turkey. And that begins now in this world. The Christians had established themselves. So 1099. Now fast forward to 1144. So roughly 50 years, a little less than 50 years. The Seljuk Turks begin to get their strength, and they begin to move into that area, and they capture Edessa, Edessa, which is that northernmost point. And they begin to pressure in, and Jerusalem is threatened. So what happens is, and the city was captured, it was Imad al-Din Zengi, and he was basically a Tebagate, or a tributary prince, so to speak, of the Seljuk Empire. And he founded the Zengid dynasty in his own right. And they were now under threat. And eventually the 17, depending on the population estimates, between 17 to 40,000 Armenian Christians were wiped out or banished from that area. So they were kind of kicked out. The bishop of that area was sent over to Rome to plead with the Pope for another crusade. And this is the important part. So it was Hugh of Jabala who was sent over to basically plead with the Pope to say, look, bring me back, or do a second crusade to bring this area back, to reinforce it, to go. Because what happened after the first crusade, everybody went over. There was huge armies that went over. It was basically multiple flags from all these kingdoms within Europe went over, captured the areas. They did a surprise attack against the Egyptian army and pretty much won the day, and they were able to establish. But what happened is most of the guys went back home, right? They got they were absolved from sin because they took part in the crusade, right? So, okay, great. All my sins are forgiven. I got my loot. I'm going home. And so it was left to whoever was left to try to manage this. So it was very much understaffed, and a lot of the kind of the prime folks left. The true believers kind of stayed, that believed that this was a holy mission. The other guys that were kind of there for, okay, my bad past is gone, and I got some coin. I'm going back home. They were gone. So it really was very difficult to be able to maintain that. It's one of the things that's lost in a lot of the narratives. But we see what happens was the bishop the Bishop of Jabala, I think it's right, and his name was Hugh. This is the funny part. So Bishop Hugh went to go see Pope Eugene at the time to say, hey, it's almost like a comedy routine there. It's like Hugh and Eugene. But basically, Bishop Hugh went to go see Pope Eugene, and he pleaded to please come in there. But there is no record, and this is the important part. When we look at the documentation of Prester John, the legend now says that because Hugh of Jabala had gone there and told the Pope, this is the important part in the legend, it says he told the Pope that just over to the other side of the Seljuk Turks, just over the other side of the Islamic army in India, there is a priest king with a large army that had defeated the Seljuks, and he was on his way, but he got stopped at the Tigris River, right? The Tigris was flooded and he couldn't come over. All we have to do is get an army to come over there by time, and that army is going to come right back over. Then that large, gigantic Christian empire that's just over there that nobody's ever heard about, it's going to come over here and save the day, and we'll be great. But is that really it? Well, the only documentation that we have is there's a Bishop Otto of Freising, and he wrote a chronology. And he had gone down to Rome also 1144. He wrote the chronology in 1145. So he was there at the same time that Bishop Hugh of Jabala was there. And if you read the chronology, what it says is that while he was there in court, he met Bishop Hugh from Jabala, and he heard of all of the deprivations. He heard of the what they had done to the Armenian Christians. He heard what they were threatening now Jerusalem, and we were in a precarious place in the Holy Land and the kingdom of Jerusalem and in the kingdom of Edessa, or the country of Edessa. They weren't called kingdoms because that was a legal term, but the country of Edessa. And that was a problem. And then he heard a story about Prester John, and he included that in there. But within at least the ones that we can see from the Catholic Church, at least in the archives, there may be something that we didn't see, but in looking at the archives and looking at the new Catholic Encyclopedia, which is actually very good for source documents on this legend, nothing was in there except this is the source document. Then when we looked at the translation of Bishop Otto of Freising, that's all he says. I also met a guy from there, and he told me this story. There's no evidence that the Pope heard the story, or if he did, that he even responded to it. Because in the end of the documents from the Catholic Church, from the Pope on the Second Crusade, which was launched in 1145, there is nothing about Prester John. That's an important point. So there's nothing in there about the Prester John legend. And so the Second Crusade was launched. It didn't do good like the First Crusade. That the country of Edessa, and Edessa itself was lost. And the oldest Christian confederation was lost for eternity. So that was the oldest at that time, Christian confederation, and it was gone. That was wiped out. So that was kind of a psychological blow for the Christian West. Now, the kingdom of Jerusalem still held during the Second Crusade, and so it was still there. So the trading points, Acre was the important one. That was still a trading point, and that was still going in there. Now, during this period of time, again, that's the only documentation we have. 1145 in the Chronicles, Bishop Otto of Freising, that's it, right? There's nothing else. But if you read the internet and all histories today, they say, the Pope acted upon this story. There's no evidence of that, right? And would he do that? No. Because one of the things he would act upon is the trade routes now are under fire. There's a tremendous amount of trade, not just in Rome, but in Constantinople, in the Byzantine Empire, from the trade. What happened before this? In the 10th century, just before the First Crusade, you had the rise of three massive oligarchies. And people that are on this channel understand about oligarchies, right? There are three massive oligarchies that are in the Italian area. They're based in the Italian area, but their trade is maritime trade. We talked earlier about the maritime trade being the trade. The land routes are one thing, but the maritime trade is going to get you the volume, the speed, the distance. That's the way to go. And these three trading houses in Genoa, in Venice, and in Pisa, those three groups became basically oligarchies. And one of them, the Venetians, were able to get concessions from the Byzantine Empire. So they had really premium real estate in the capital city of Constantinople, a massive trade center in Constantinople. They were able to manage to somehow get 0% or near 0% taxation on the goods that they brought in. And in certain things, they got salt concessions, which was massive. Remember, the Romans actually used salt as salary. That's where we get the word salary from, sal. They were actually able to do that. Huge concessions, right? So they got power. And the grandson of the Byzantine Empire that gave them that power, he believed, probably rightfully so, that the political power that the Venetians were in moving into Byzantine was offsetting his autonomy. And this is something we see throughout history. And if it's very good to read Machiavelli, Defenders of Freedom. It's a good book. But Machiavelli, people talk of him as if he was a bad guy. He was exposing the bad guys in a way. He was exposing the Venetians versus the Genoans. He was exposing a central state versus kind of a city-state autonomous local government. He was exposing that, right? So his book, The Prince, is actually about mechanisms of control by people like these oligarchs, right? The Venetians. Again, the Venetians versus the Genoans. Look that up. And then, of course, the Pisanos in the side are kind of the third rung, but it was just remarkable. The power that they had, the ability to be able to shape events around them. They were also supportive of the Crusades. Why? Because number one, you were able to kind of get a foothold. You were able to get dedicated ports for their trade goods. And it was with the Christian West, so it was a little easier sometimes to be able to negotiate, get better rates. So they were able to negotiate to get those rates, and you're cutting out some of the middlemen, right? So the port middlemen, guess what? Now we're those guys, right? So that's an additional profit because we're tying directly in. We're cutting out the middleman. We're cutting directly into some of those guys coming in. And it wasn't just the West. It wasn't just Western traders that were getting this kind of profit. There was an Islamic, I believe it was a Seljuk Turk, an Islamic trader who was able to kind of trade with the Christians. So he was doing it on the other side. He was bringing in goods and services and selling it to the Christians or selling it to the Venetians and the Genovese that were in that area. And he made so much money. He made like almost 2 years of worth of profits in 1 month of shipments. So this guy was phenomenal. He was phenomenally rich. And when he died, he was buried because he had donated so much money to the Islamic faith. He changed at Mecca, he changed the silver fountain to a gold fountain. He bought a gold fountain. He's like, here you go, I'm dedicating this. And with the original cover for the Kaaba, the sacred area that houses the rock in the middle of Mecca, the Kaaba, when that was damaged, or it was either old or damaged, depending on how you translate it, he bought a brand new one out of probably silk, and he covered that, and he says, here you go, no problem. And he would help. So he had the honor of being buried, the rare honor of being buried in Mecca. He was not a religious leader. He was a trading guy, but because of his generosity and tremendous wealth, they said, guess what? You can be buried in Mecca. And on his gravestone, it's very unique because it says, not only will Allah bless you, but Allah will bless anyone that blesses your name. So that was the level of status that trade had in that area and the level of power that they were able to kind of have. So it worked both ways. And you cannot discount the role of the Venetians, the role of the Genovians, the role of the Pisanos in that crusade and in moving the crusade there. If there was a crusade, it had to be funded. It had to be supplied logistically. Who had the ships to bring it over, right? So looking at the logistical support for the crusades and eventually the kingdom of Jerusalem and the country of Edessa, that was the trading houses, the oligarchies, right, that were based in Italy, but working more or less with the Byzantines. Now, what happened over time, and this again feeds into the story, after 1144, so the country of Edessa fell, the city of Edessa fell, the pressure was on the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Byzantine emperor begins to go against the Venetians. He believes they have too much power. Remember, we talked to his grandfather. He believed his grandfather gave away the farm, and he's like, "Nah, this is too much." So he's coming in to kind of control the oligarchs in his area. So what he does is he begins to increase the tax rate on the Venetians. He says, "You're not going to have that section of our city anymore. And oh, by the way, your two competitors, which are the Genoa and Pisa, we're going to give them tax breaks. And depending what it was between 4 to 10% tax. So he reduced it, and up some goods down to about 4%. So he gives them economic advantage, the competitors, he gives them economic advantage, and he begins to give them prime real estate. They both now have some of that prime real estate in Constantinople. So there's no longer a monopoly by the Venetians in the Byzantine Empire. And that creates a lot of problems. About 20 years after what we're going to talk about here, it got so bad, the tension was so bad that he just started arresting the Venetians. He arrested the Venetian leaders. He was grabbing up a lot of their assets and making them Byzantine assets, nationalizing the assets in a modern kind of sense. That was going on. So the tension was there. So the tension it wasn't like there was a Christian world and an Islamic world. There was a lot of trade. When we read the source documents from that area, one of the interesting parts that comes out is that if you've been in the kingdom of Jerusalem for a while, you're going to be interacting with the Islamics. You're going to be interacting with a lot of different groups. When somebody's fresh off the boat from let's say France, the kingdom of the Frankish kingdom, they come over and they hop off the boat. The first thing that the problems that they have is that those new guys, those FOB guys, they're like, how dare you interact with anybody that's not, a Christian? And even then they were upset at some of the Byzantines, right? They didn't like the contractors, if you will. They're like, those are Byzantines, we're with the Catholics. And so there was a lot of problems with some of the folks that were coming fresh off the boat that were over there. But if you've been there a while, you start trading. Now, the same thing occurred in the Seljuk Turk areas. The more the conservative, I hate to use that word conservative, but the more the people were focused on religion in the Seljuk Turk area and not so much the economic part, they were saying the same things to, for example, this trading dynasty guy, that you can't do that, right? You can't trade with the Christians. How dare you, right? They're killing our people. You can't trade with the Christians, but it was going on. And so you have the same dynamic on both sides of the fence. And over time, it would either exacerbate or go down, but the trade continued, the information continued. Now, this is the important part. We are trading with, or the West is trading with the Seljuks, and the Seljuks were also involved. Now, if you look at that map earlier that I showed you from that book, right? You think kind of the empire ends there, right? The Seljuk Turks just kind of stop, right? And that's it. However, what's important to understand is that in this legend, let me see if I can find the cursor here. There we go. Within this, it actually spreads out a little bit further. Let's take a look at the Seljuk Empire on a normal map. Now, you can see, of course, here is the, depending on the area, they got the Ottoman side, but you're looking at what they had been able to kind of capture at the height of their power. And that's, of course, capturing Jerusalem. At the time that we're talking about, they don't have the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they had just captured Edessa. So some of that, which is shown up there, is actually going to be in the column of the West, in the Byzantine column, or the Roman column, Western Roman column, the Catholics column. And then up north, there, depending, it was kind of a mobile area, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this map includes India. Now you can see the Himalayas. Look, there's Afghanistan, right? Tajikistan, Waziristan, Kyrgyzstan, the modern cities. There's, you can see Nepal in there, right? What's now Pakistan. So this entire area, and we're still in this contact point, right? We were in Afghanistan, I don't know, 20 years. So all of this is still in play. And there's the Strait of Hormuz, right? You see there, there's the Yemen down there. So these areas are very old lines of conquest and trade and routes and resources. So everywhere you have routes and resources, you're going to have not only trade, but you're going to have conflict because you want to grab those routes and resources. But here's the important part. Now, for the legend of Prester John, this takes a little turn. In, as I said, 1145, there's a Christian kingdom just over to the east that had beaten the Seljuk Turks. And you think, well, the Gospel of St. Thomas in 45 AD, maybe that was the source of it. We thought there was a huge empire, but that's just some converts. Why would we think there's a large kingdom and an army? Why would Bishop Hugh of Jabala even be talking about this? Well, the reason is because there actually was an army up there. And in a 3-day battle, which was kind of the story of the Prester John, they actually beat the Seljuk Turks. In fact, so bad that the Seljuk Turks, the Khwarazm, which was one group that was initially tributary state or puppet state to the Seljuk Turks, now was tributary to this group. And they said, but were they Christian, right? That's the question. And the answer is no, but yes. And here's where it gets fun. So we're going to look at what was just north of this, right? So look at the kind of the northeast border of, this is why maps are important. You got to keep backing up. The northeast border of what we're looking at here in the Seljuk Turk area. And you're going to find a group called the Karakatai. Now, the Karakatai are basically Manchus, Mongols, Uyghurs, everything mixed in there. By the time they get here, by the time they go from being Kitai to becoming Karakatai, they kind of blended in everybody that was in that region or that area. And it's important because you have to see that, whoops, let's do this. Haha. Okay, there we go. So, let's see, looking at this, you're going to see that the Karakatai kind of took over that area that's just north of the Seljuk Empire. And the Khwarazm that were there, they got them to be tributary. The Seljuks themselves they had been beaten in a 3-day battle. The Karakatai beat them. And so they were now paying tribute to the Karakatai. So the Karakatai leave them alone so the Seljuk Turks can focus on the south, right? They can focus on those crusaders that are down there in the area, right? They can focus on, who's the upstart that's moving around. They have all kind of internal problems as well. There's a lot going on. So I'm just going to pay these guys so we don't have to, we don't have to worry about them too much. So that's what's going on. So that legend it meets some of the things, but what about the Christian part? Well, here's the interesting part. There's a fascinating story, or a fascinating research, I should say, not a story. There's a fascinating research by, if you have JSTOR, this is another one for the Centurion group that's watching. JSTOR is absolutely a great resource. Let me get back up to the secondary camera here. Okay. And oh my goodness, it's terrible. Let's see. Hang on just a second. Nope. Yep. Okay. So I don't know if you can see that, but JSTOR is basically a you can either log in through your college institution, or you can pay for a subscription service. But these are academic articles and research papers that go back some cases 150 years. They're really good. You can look it up by search. It's really well indexed and everything like that by topic, and the source notes are very, very good. There's, of course, it is an academic based approach. Now, this was actually interesting. This was done by a Chinese scholar of PhD researcher, but what she did, though, was part of it was also looking at field work, looking at archaeology. What is beyond kind of just the textual analysis? What is the early Christianity in the areas that we think of as Central Asia, the Central Asian, right? What's now Tajikistan, Waziristan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all the stands, and then into Mongolia, into Manchuria. And as we mentioned before, remember with Persia, it was easy to kind of move across. Zoroastrianism was a monotheism, but it allowed other religions in it. And so you had Judaism and Christianity and other thoughts, Buddhism, move over and be able to intermingle and intermix. And in that, there was a group of Nestorians, as she points out, that converted some high members of some of the tribes, like the Onglut and eventually the Karait and the Naiman. But the Karait are the interesting ones because eventually the story moves into the Mongols themselves, and we'll hear that in a minute. But within that, remember the Karakatai used to be the Katai, and the Katai were, unfortunately, sometimes we'll hear them called Liao, which is wrong. But they would move over to, let's remove that, and there we go. They started out as the Katai, and they were a Manchu. They were Jurchens, right, which is over in Manchuria. And then they were a mix. There were some Mongol groups, families that kind of merged in there. But they created a Katai empire, not Liao. The Chinese called them Lao. The Han called them Lao. Some of the Qing also called them Lao. But they were basically Jurchens. They were Manchus, and they created this empire that went all the way from what's Xinjiang through Mongolia into Siberia. They have Vladivostok, Petropavlovsk. Now it's Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk, and then down into parts of North Korea, right? And then now what's used to be Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula. It's a pretty big empire, and that lasted from about 900 to about 1100. But what happens is the Mongols begin to put pressure on them. The Mongols begin to form up a little larger bands. They begin to politically unify, or at least unify for raids, and then they begin to move in and put pressure. The empire, the Katai Empire, collapses, but the ruling families and some of the leading groups band together and they go west, right? So they head west and they begin to form their own empire, their second empire, which is the Kara Katai group, right? So now we're going to move in here, and they move all the way across and they set up a new kingdom. And they're the ones that hit them. And so within that band, yes, there are Nestorian Christians. There are those that have converted to either Mazdaism or Christianity from that. It's interesting because the legend of Prester John, as we'll see in the second iteration, the second document that comes out that's known, it claims that he is of the descendant of the three magi, one of the lands of the three magi. Now, most people wouldn't understand that the Magi today, because the information about Zoroastrianism in Persia is kind of lost or hidden or just not talked about because it's inconvenient. But the Magi were basically Zoroastrian priests. That was their names for Zoroastrian priests. They worshipped the Ahura Mazda, which was a one god, a monotheistic god, and they believed in good and evil. They believed you do good on earth, you're going to go to a heaven. If you do bad, you're going to go down to Spetamanyu, which is the devil. And so this predates this is where it's controversial, but it predates basically Judaism, right? And there was a large group of Judeans that were in Babylon during this time for about 250 years. They were intermingling with Zoroastrians in the capital city of Babylon, right? Before they were returned or moved as a buffer population, depending on how you read it, back to Judea, right? And so they would have taken some of that with them. And there is textual analysis, if we take the emotion out of it, that's where it is, okay? So having said that, you look at some of this thing, the Magi, right? Now, up in this area, the Persian areas, the Nestorians, this older version, that's the Magi. So the land of the Persian, the land in Zoroastrianism is associated with Magi. In the early church and the early ideas of the West, they had been exposed to Zoroastrianism. Many of Islam had been exposed to Zoroastrianism, so they understood it. They understood what Magi meant. It meant Zoroastrianism. Now, they didn't see it as a monotheism because it didn't lend itself to that chain of command or that chain of authority that came from Abraham, Isaac, and through, so that it was seen as separate. Whereas Islam did give deference to Abraham and Moses and Jesus, the Christians gave deference to Moses and Abraham and Isaac. And so you had a connection, right? They were related, right? They were cousins, right? Now they would fight each other to tooth and nail to the death, but they still fit within the worldview. Zoroastrianism was enough out that it was too alien for them, even though it was an originating concept, that it was something else entirely. It was out. But Nestorianism was a seen at different times as heretical, or it needs to convert in. We'll allow them to convert in. It's not totally heresy, but it is. But we'll allow them in. They're not pagans, but they're not accepted. And so you'll see at different times the church will have different edicts against, for example, Nestorians or Mazdekians and that sort of thing. So it's very interesting to see these different competing versions, against Gnostics, against that sort of thing. So if you look at this group, there were within the Katakatai, they were predominantly Buddhist, but there were Nestorians, and it wasn't a exclusive, right? So in the West, since about 300 AD, roughly, when the Council of Nicaea came, when Constantinople or Emperor Constantine of Rome said, there's only one religion, this is it. And over time, that became the rule in the West. There's only one religion. That's the official religion. Now, they would tolerate Jews. They would tolerate non-ruling Islam because Christianity has to be prime. But everything else was prescribed. There's a state religion, that's it. Also in Islam, there was a state religion, right? A Christian or a Jew could never become a leader within Islam. You could exist there. You could be a doctor. There were certain jobs that were still open for you, but you couldn't lead, right? And officially, you had to pay a dhimma tax, right? So you're at a different level. There's an official state religion, and that's the ruling class. The ruling class is going to be Islamic. And the West, Christianity was the ruling class. That's the way it's going to be. The same as when there was the Hasmoneans in Judea, the same thing. The Jewish is the ruling class. That's the way it's going to be. And so that was the Western thought. Zoroastrianism, that wasn't there. Buddhism, it wasn't there. So therefore, when the Katakatai and the Mongols, there's not this official religion. And so it was very confusing in the mix of East and West to not have an official religion. So if there was a leader that was of a certain religion, the West would assume, well, that must be the official religion, right? That was their paradigm, their Bader Meinhof, right? Because they had grown up that way. They hadn't been exposed to something else. So they couldn't recognize that everybody can have their own religion within the Katakatai. Didn't matter. So the beginnings of the Prester John legend, most of the evidence leads to a potential, because of so many parallels. You have the same battle, the 3-day battle that the Katakatai fought, and they beat the Seljuk Turks, and they got tribute. The legend of Prester John, the origin, he's descendant of the Magi. So there's a lot of parallels that kind of move through this that lend itself to, this is a tale that was told about an actual event, but it morphed over time through the trade routes and in the interchange between the people that were trading and telling the stories and the news about what was happening in the north to a bishop or someone in the kingdoms, the Christian kingdoms, listening to it. They would say, wait, those are Nestorians. And it fits in with the legends that were, for example, the St. Thomas from 45 AD. All of that kind of fit within their worldview, and then they expanded upon it. But again, there was no evidence that the Pope acted upon it, but it was something that would inspire the people to be able to go fight, right? Because, hey, there's relief available. I just have to hold out a little bit longer, and then the cavalry is going to come over the hill and save us, right? And that happens many, many times in history, not just this time. But that story keeps people motivated, but it's not the motivator for the leadership who has to worry about trade routes and profits and how to support this thing and keep it going and maintain your control at home. So let's fast forward a little bit. If we go forward to now 1160s, what happens is remember, the Venetians are beginning to be hit by the Byzantines. The Byzantines are taking away power from the Venetians, and there's tension going on. There's also still increasing tension between the Byzantines and the Romans, the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Orthodox. So there's a lot of problems, a lot of things that are occurring at that time. And one of the things that happens is this letter suddenly shows up to the emperor of Constantinople, so the Byzantine emperor, and it's supposedly from Prester John, right? Shocking. So here we are in 1160. This letter shows up addressed to the governor of Rome, which is a complete insult, right? It's like looking at the Pope and going, "Hey, the mayor of Rome," right? Or looking at the president of the United States and going, "Hey, the mayor of DC," right? So depending on your political angle, you may say that, but basically that was the level of insult that this letter came from. It came initially in Latin, but it was translated into every language in the West that was used in the West, and it was just widely disseminated, which in those days is very hard to do. So it's almost like a trash talking post on X that just gets sent all over the place. This thing was all over the place. The Pope actually, or excuse me, the Byzantine Emperor actually sent it to the Holy Roman Empire at the time. It was Friedrich Barbarossa the First. He sent it to him, and then the Western Pope, the Catholic Pope, got a copy of it. So this thing was all over the place. It's very long, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to try to see if I can share the screen to show you the translation, because in the language, remember we talked about the stories, and in the language, that's very important for understanding. There we go. The ideals, and let's see if this is going to work. Supposed to share. Here we go. Add to stage. There we go. All right. I'm going to try to make it even bigger. There we go. All right. So looking here at what we've got, the letter comes from Prester John. It says, "I, Prester John, by the virtue in God, Lords Emmanuel, governor to Emmanuel." So this is Emperor Emmanuel, the Byzantine emperor, governor of Romans. So Emmanuel calling him, "Hey, Emmanuel, governor of the Romans." So that right there is throwing shade, right? So it's very disrespectful, especially in those days. And it goes on and on and on. And it does two things. If you look at here, it's not asking for another crusade. It's not asking you anything else. It's basically doing couple things. One is it's presenting this model of a perfect kingdom under Prester John. And it's like the kingdom of heaven on earth almost under Prester John. At the same time, it's putting down the emperor of the Byzantine emperor. And you're going to see this. It says, "Of course, we are only human, take a good faith." It said that the people believe you a god, but we know you're just there. And thanks for your tribute, because it's trivialities. But it makes you wonder who wrote this, right? And so that's what we kind of want to get into. Who wants to use the name of Prester John, the legend of Prester John? And it has to be something that was talked about at the time, because why would you use a character that nobody knew about? So it has to have some kind of cachet within the culture, that since 1145, which was the last time we had a document about Prester John, it's now 1160, 20 years later. And Prester John never showed up in the Second Crusade, so you'd think it would be disgraced, but perhaps it had become something like a Santa Claus or maybe a Captain America, that becomes a symbol that's used at higher echelons, perhaps, to kind of emphasize that. So if you're wanting something to kind of degrade, an American leader, you would use Captain America. How dare you? That sort of thing. So that's a possibility. The other possibility, and that's what might make it now. Who hates the Venetian, or who hates the Byzantine emperor? Well, that's the Venetians, right? Because he's taking away their area. He's taking away their profits. He's taking away their concessions, and they have the means, the motive, and the opportunity. They have a motive, they have the opportunity, and they have the means. They have trading networks all over. Everywhere this letter shows up, there's a trading outpost that they go to. They print all the time. They have contracts, they have bills of lading, they have, the exchanges or receipts. They're doing printing in all different languages all over the place. So they have the means to be able to do it. They have the motive to be able to do it. The other theory that I've heard, or hypothesis on this one, is that it was done by a priest that was upset with the Byzantines leaning too much into the trade network. Like, you should have just gotten rid of the Venetians, right? So, and you're not holy. You're not being as holy as you should be, because you are doing deals with other groups. I don't know if they would have the means to be able to do that within as much and as far as this letter was seen. But it's interesting. The other thing is, you'll notice that it changes the tense. It'll talk about I, and then it talks about we, and it goes back and forth between the two. It's possible that it was actually made up by a number of people and kind of consolidated together very quickly. But it goes on and on and on. You'll see here. I mean, it's a long letter that's written, and it goes on and on and on and on. And I said, it does two things. It throws shade on the Byzantine empires, that you're just kind of this unworthy person. But the second thing is, it kind of contrasts the Byzantine Empire with Prester John, and talking about, I, Prester John, am the Lord of lords that surpass in all riches which are under heaven, in virtue and in power, all the kings of the wide world. 72 kings are tributaries to us. And in the West, Byzantine and the Pope can't even get along, right? You've got an Eastern Rome, you've got an Eastern Orthodox and a Western Orthodox empire. But over here, all 72 kings bow down to me, you know. So it's kind of emphasizing that the Byzantine doesn't have all of the Christian kingdoms bowing down to him. And it goes further. I'm a devout Christian, and everywhere we do defend poor Christians whom the empire of our clemency rules, and we sustain them with alms. We have vowed to visit the sepulchre of the Lord with greatest army, just as benefiting the glory of our majesty, in order to humble and defeat the enemies of the cross of Christ and to exalt his blessed name. So they're saying, we're going to go there with our big army. We can do that. Now, was Byzantine supporting the Crusades as much as he should? That could be an issue. So by emphasizing what this mythical king was doing, this Prester John was doing, you're putting pressure, or at least public propaganda, to emphasize what the Byzantine emperor isn't doing and is not, right? In other words, you're kind of using this to contrast it. But to the maybe the uninitiated, what this looks then is that there is a legend of Prester John. This actually excites people's imaginations in those days that, oh, wow, this is it. And this works its way over time into a reality. People actually believe this is occurring just over the hill. And to the group, that contact area, right? Remember, there's still those legends. Those legends still exist because the Karakatai are just north of the Seljuk Turks, and they're interacting with them, and they did beat them. It was a big army. They kind of beat them, and they're Nestorian Christians there. And you know, some of the leaders are Nestorian Christians, so therefore the whole thing must be Nestorian Christian. So you have the possibility that seed of truth continued to kind of feed it, and it validates the myth, right, that goes on, because there's a little bit of truth in there that validates the myth. You see a lot of these with World War II. A lot of these. World War II is probably the most mythical war, almost. That it's the most talked about mythical war, I should put it that way, because they have like these little seeds of truth, and then they just go off on it. I'll be on a tangent on that one. Let's keep going with this. So you'll notice that throughout here, he goes on and on and on about it's a land of milk and honey. It's a land of riches. It's a land of everything. Phenomenal. And this feeds into this idea, this promise that there's something just over the hill that's a Christianity. And it's very important to understand that this is a time when the West is being pressured, right? They had kind of gotten Jerusalem back. The Holy Land returned, in the Christian mind, it returned to the Christian. Jerusalem is back in the Christian hands where it should be. And now it's under threat. And if we lose, and remember in those days, if you lose in combat, it's divine, right? It's the same as the at the time, the Judaic thought, which was, well, if I lose, it's there. Inshallah is not a concept only to the Islamics. There's a version of inshallah with Christians. There's a version of inshallah with Jews, right? So there's this belief that if you lose in combat, it's divine will, and we didn't live up to the law. If we had just been holy enough, if we had just lived enough, if we had just done whatever we were supposed to do right, if we did whatever the Pope told us to do to the letter of the law, we would have been able to hold Jerusalem, and the Islamics wouldn't have come in. So there's the danger, that epistemological moment, the epistemological danger that you've grabbed it. You've now built your worldview around it. But if Islam grabs it, it creates a paradigmatic shift. How do you deal with that? And so this fantasy, this dream of just over the hill, is something that every frontier group in a fort had, right? Hold out, because you know the First Nation tribe is attacking us, right? The Comanche they've surrounded the town and they're raiding us. Just over the hill, there's going to be cavalry. Don't worry, they're coming to save you, right? French Foreign Legion in the forts, right? The famous, kind of the famous trope. Just wait. There's another unit coming to march to save us, right? That is existing throughout all time, because people want that. They need that to keep going. And so part of that is the legend of Prester John takes hold, because it represents a saving from elsewhere, because basically the home area, right, between the Romans and the Byzantines, it was messed up. There was a lot of infighting. The Christians kingdoms would fight themselves more than they would fight the Islamic kingdoms. And when you visit the Holy Land, you see that, well, they're trading with the supposed enemy, the infidel. How is this possible, right? What's going on? So there was a lot of contradictions in the mind of people that were pure in their thought process for Christianity. In other words, they didn't look at the practical, they only looked at the religious. And when they saw the reality of the world, it created this dichotomy that had to be rectified. So therefore, when you look at this legend, over the hill, there's a perfect kingdom. It's beautiful. This is finally the way it is. It's a priest and a king. He's able to merge both. You see the similar within the legends of King David, right? The legends of the Jewish Messiah is that basically this is finally perfect, right? We can finally have a heaven on earth. But until then, we have to live in the earthly ways. And that's part of Prester John, is trying to create that image of the heaven on earth. This is what it's going to look like. This is done right. But they actually believed it existed because there was just enough of a parallel up north with the Katakatai. But as we'll see soon, that also came crashing down. And did it destroy the legend, or did the legend adapt itself so that people could continue to have this belief system that was kind of a coping mechanism, if you will? So that's interesting. If you're interested, if you go to blackcentraleurope.com sources, there's a letter from Prester John translated. You can look in the notes there. It talks about the original Latin and basically goes through. You should probably take it from Latin and run it through AI and have it retranslated again. I didn't have time before then, but he lists a source. That's a good thing. And then it goes through, and without a lot of comment, just there it is. There's the translation. So it's very, very telling to read it because it changes the tense. It's I, then it's we, then it's us, then it goes back to I, and then what it talks about. So it's almost like there's multiple authors, perhaps a couple, putting things together very quickly, and then they just disseminated it more to throw shade on the Byzantine Empire, present a contrast, but it would excite his people. We need to get over there. This is how it is. So it puts pressure on him because you've kind of made a public appeal that goes out there. So it's very interesting how much of a political document this is. And did it have any effect on the Byzantine Empire? That's the next step. We haven't been able to go in there, but I would be interested to see how, besides sending it to Friedrich Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Empire, what effect did this have upon the Byzantine Emperor at that point? It may have been part of his decision to kind of shut down the Venetians. He may have found out that it was the Venetians that did this, and that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. And he finally just confiscated and started confiscating their assets and arresting their leaders. Who knows? So there's that. Let's go forward real quick. We don't have much time, but going forward a little bit into the trade routes, I wanted to show you that because that's also important. So this is what I'm talking about with the trade routes. Now you see it's the Persians had built up a very viable trade route just above Saudi Arabia that goes in there over to India and into what's now Turkey and into the Levant, which is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the Romans had part of that. They were dealing in trade goods all the way into India. In fact, the Byzantines had actually had trade routes into the Red Sea. The Byzantine Empire was also, before the Islamic conquest, was getting involved in the war between Yemen and Ethiopia. Yemen had turned, the leadership had converted to Judaism, and Ethiopia had converted to Christianity. And so the Byzantine Empire was actually sending, and it was, again, routes and resources, right? Which group was trading. And so the Byzantine Empire threw some of its weight behind the Ethiopians and supplying them ships to be able to go up and to kind of, wage war against the Yemenites in Saudi Arabia. So that was the extent. So remember, Europe was actually down into the Red Sea. They were down into that area. What's now Yemen, up there in Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. But that's where the Byzantines were. The Romans were there. The Byzantines were there. Now, when the Byzantines left, they never went back to that region, but they were still within what we call the Levant, which is Judea. Now is Israel and Syria and Lebanon. So that was still viable. And then, of course, areas in Turkey with the Christian kingdom in Edessa, which is up in Urfa, Turkey now. So this is much more dynamic and probably not exactly what you were taught if you were of an older generation within the public schools. Nowadays, it's kind of a mix. Some do, some don't. But that trade network is important. Now, what happens is on the far end of the trade network, kind of in the same area, that the Katai had come from. And the very people that had beaten them out of that area where they were before, they get together and they start the march. And of course, we're talking about the Mongols. And the Mongols is kind of the next phase of this story. Because the next time that we hear about this is around 1230s, 1240s. The legend of Prester John resurfaces again. But this time, it's his son, right? It's King, and they call him King David. So Prester John is now passed because otherwise he would be over 100 years old. And rather than going into biblical kind of legendary lifespans, they say, okay, it's his son, it's King David, and he's at this huge army, and now he's on the march, right? Before King Prester John was like, but his son, King David, he's actually doing it. He's going on the march and he's wiping out everybody, all the enemies of the cross before him. And he's going to be marching to the Holy Sepulchre and everybody's going to get waxed. And the news that's coming through, again, with those contact points with the Seljuk Turks in the trade areas, it reinforces this. The Seljuk Turks are in a panic because they're getting beat and everybody's getting beat. They're like, oh, this is great, right? So they hear rumors of India because they're trading with the Indians. So the Indians in that region, those kingdoms, they're getting waxed. And then it goes up further. So the area in the Sindh continent, that gets waxed. So all of these areas are getting wiped out, and there's this huge euphoria within the West initially because they believe that the army of God is now coming down to them. And this explains when you read about people believe that Genghis Khan was sent by God as a hammer. Some people say, well, how would you think that? Because it had been seeded beforehand with this legend of Prester John, because the Katakatai, people can't differentiate between the Katakatai and the Mongols, right? Because they essentially came from the kind of the same group. They had the same trappings, mostly the same background, Manchus, Jurchens, and Mongolians. But basically that they moved from that region. And so as the Mongols kind of moved out, they believe that it's the same group. In addition, as was put forward in that paper about the early Christian groups in that area, some of the tribes had actually converted over. And it did turn out that Genghis Khan's son had married a Christian, and they had 3 children, and their kids had Christian names. So there were princes essentially of Genghis Khan that were Christian and had Christian names. So it was easy to kind of see that when you put all this together. Now you can kind of understand the decision point, or at least what they were thinking in the West. When they said, here comes the army of the cross is going to destroy all the enemies of the cross. And their initial enemies were the ones that they had been fighting, the Seljuk Turks and that sort of thing. But then they began to move on. And as everyone knows, they split into 2. One army kind of continued on what's now Russia. It was moving toward Russia. It was destroying the Eastern Europeans. And then the other army turned south, and it didn't differentiate. It just kept moving as much as it could. And so when the army of Genghis Khan, the Mongols, began to defeat the Christian empire, that was the epistemological shift. It was like, oh no, what do we do here? And so at that point, you see a lot of diplomatic. It's very interesting, the papers that go between the Roman Catholic Church and the Mongols. There was this huge diplomatic flurry that went back and forth where the Pope was saying, you should go ahead and convert because you're an historian, you're already halfway there, but now come all the way into the faith. And Genghis Khan had a different worldview because he wasn't Prester John. He wasn't the son of Prester John. He said in Tingri, and he said, Tingri is the universe, it's everything. And I know I'm right because if I'm successful, I'm right. If I fail, it's because, he didn't bless what I was doing. Again, kind of an inshallah attitude, right? Even Genghis Khan had it. And so he said that if you want, Pope, you can come here and meet me and bring your guys, and you could try to sell it to me here, but you got to come here. I'm not gonna come to you, right? You probably don't want me to come to you. And so that was the issue. And he would have kept going in the South, again, because of trade routes. He was following those trade routes. He was tapping into those trade routes and utilizing basically the infrastructure that was there to move. In addition to the grasslands north, he could bypass the trade routes, which was an advantage that he had because they were all mobile on horses. Different topic, but it allows you to kind of move forward and into Russia very quickly and easily, and then move down south using, again, the trade routes if you needed to. And so this went on for a while until Genghis Khan, of course, has a heart attack, and then everybody retreats, and the West says, okay, great. Whew. That was from God. Now the hammer of God now became the scourge of God, and God has released our punishment, and he's going back, and the Mongols leadership had gone back to vote on their new leader. And so it was seen, and then emissaries were sent from the West to try to deal with the Mongols, again, to get them on their side, the enemy by enemy, because they saw the Seljuk Turks as the big threat, even though the Seljuk Turks had now been essentially kind of wiped out mostly by the Mongols. And now we have Marco Polo. Marco Polo goes forward, and he's as much as looking for trade routes and securing the trade deals with the Mongols, because they're now sitting on the real estate that's this trade route, right? So Marco Polo comes from the territory, and he works with the oligarchies that are there, the trade oligarchies, because they want to secure deals. There's a different episode I did for another show, actually a live show called The Case of the Venetian Blinds, about the Venetians that dealt with the Mongols to the detriment of the Byzantine Empire, to the detriment of other Christian kingdoms in that area. They had no problem with that. The Venetians were like, nope, no problem. Right. And we have the same thing today with oligarchs that tend to deal with, for example, the CCP, and they don't care if it hurts America or not. Right. Even if they're American, they grow up here, the kids go to school here, they got their money, they're starting in America, they don't care. They'll deal with the CCP. That archetype is still out there. And it was there in those days with the Venetians, the Genoans, and the Pisanos. So Marco Polo is working for mostly to try to get trade routes back. And he's doing his travel log, and he goes to the east. And what he sees is mostly the Katai, right? He interacts with the Katai, and he calls them Cathay, and he sees the Mongols as Cathay. And then that gets transferred to Cathay, which becomes basically another word for China. So we're again, here's another myth. They think we're dealing with China. They're not. They're dealing with the steppe tribes, right? They're dealing with Jurchens. They're dealing with what we call Manchus, Jurchens, various groups of Jurchens, various groups of Mongolians, different tribes of the steppe. that were all now banded together in kind of an empire, a loose empire, but they weren't Chinese, right? Even though later the Chinese would say, "Oh, that's the Liao Empire." No, and the Yuan Empire. It's a Mongol empire that conquered, the central kingdoms like Europe. Um, People know my history on that, so we won't go too much into it. But point being is that myth came through that this was China. It's not, and that was kind of reinforcing the myth. But when Marco Polo came back, he had seeded some of the things that maybe there is. I've heard the name Prester John. They talk Prester John, so it didn't dispel the myth entirely. Even though many of the other priests that went forward and that were ambassadors and emissaries to the Mongol court recognized that now the Prester John, there's nothing here. There's nothing here like Prester John. But they went and they validated. They said it's not here. But the one that came back from Marco Polo saying, "Well, I heard this and maybe this," that one kind of got legs and stuck around. The ones that said, "Yeah, there's nothing here, anything like Prester John. He never existed. There's no evidence to support it. We got Nestorians and Mazdians and mixes and hybrids, but we don't have a Prester John. There never was a Christian king." So that basically kind of got led by the leadership, but it didn't filter down to the people. So the legend of Prester John continued forward. Now, once it was absolutely known after about probably 100 years that Prester John just did not exist in the East, you would think the legend would die, but it didn't. The need for a large Christian kingdom just over there reflecting perfection was still in the minds of people. And it was used by other groups. So a group of Ethiopians, the Christian Ethiopians, remember from the ancient kingdom, the Byzantines had actually supported in their fight with the Yemenites. The Ethiopians had sent emissaries up to the Roman Catholic Church, and they said, "Oh, yeah, we know Prester John. That's it's one of our patron saints." They used the word Prester John, and eventually some groups began to use the Prester John title for their king in kind of a propaganda to get the West excited, or to get the Northerners, which were up in Rome, excited about what's going on in Africa. And you'll see by the 15th, 16th century, the geographic region has now changed from it's just on the other side of the Seljuk Turks somewhere in India. Prester John was supposed to be the emperor of India, but now that we're in India, we know he's not there. Now it changes down. It's just below Ethiopia, right? So Ethiopia maybe was a northern principality of Prester John, and it's going to be south. It's going to be somewhere in uncharted Africa is where it's going to be. And a lot of the Portuguese, because Spain had now taken over the king, the seat at the throne of Portugal. The Spanish Philip II, I believe, was expanding out. This is Spain's big expansion in the 1500s. He was capturing the Philippines. He was moving in there, and he wanted to focus. He moved a lot of Portuguese traders to go look for Prester John's kingdom, and a map made by his chief cartographer was used, and it shows the kingdom of Prester John in an unknown area south of Ethiopia. So he was very much focused on still believing that there was a large army out there that could support whoever aligned with it. And so he was doing a big push of exploration and trade to get to reach Prester John. So the legend spurred on additional exploration, trade, and perhaps motivation for some troops to be able to kind of continue on and go in areas they might not have just for profit motive, or if they didn't get a profit motive, how do you motivate the workers? And so that kind of excited people for a very long time. So at the same time that we're beginning to map the contours of what became America, we're still looking for a king who's a priest named Prester John just over the hill, just beyond that river, that has a magical kingdom that will save us all. And so that legend is very telling about what's actually going on in the world, that we have these large movements, that there is a synthesis of various religions, that Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism had merged, mixed, intermarried in some cases, separated in others, but that this exchange of ideas and people went farther and deeper than many people realize today. And that interchange, those lines from the Persians to the Greeks, from the Persians to the Romans, from the Seljuks to the Byzantines and the Catholics, continues on even today. You kind of see those same lines forming, where the stress and the strains of those lines form roughly in the same areas. And so we have to understand the routes and the resources that people are really talking about in these places that they tend to call a holy land. And that continued forward, as you know, when we talked about the Judaism versus Zionism. That land then later became a holy place. Again, it was reinstalled for Judaism, but before it had been Christianity. Now the Oliphant in Britain had said, excited people to say, look, let's make this now the Jewish homeland, because the British had a new route and resources, because they had dug through a canal, the Suez Canal, in there. So where the Byzantines would have to go overland and then build ships and go south in the Red Sea to control that area, and the Romans as well, now you can sail it straight from the Mediterranean down into the Red Sea, and that accesses those trade routes to the east. And you still needed those routes and resources. You still needed those buffer states. You still needed a kingdom of Jerusalem to act as kind of that buffer state. And that hasn't changed over time. So whether it was King Joffrey or Benjamin Netanyahu, it's the same story played out with different characters, different flags, but the terrain is the same. The routes are the same. The motives are, in my opinion, very much the same. So hopefully this has been interesting for you. For more information, I would recommend a great book that kind of goes over everything here. Let's get this in here. Maybe. Let's do that. There we go. Okay. So final one. This is Peter Frankopian. It's The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. He goes into a lot of what we talk about, and like I said, his focus is on the entirety of the range of exchange between what we call the West and the East, right? So between Europe, essentially what became Europe, and the East along the Persian Empire into Asia, what became China, what was the Sinic continent, and all of the trade that goes on, all of the history. It's absolutely fascinating. And you'll see, again, the patterns of history kind of follow along those same lines, but it's a lot more than you know. The taxes, just the information on taxes that the Romans were getting from Jerusalem, right? So in the kingdom of Judea, there's Jerusalem. The Roman taxation in the kingdom of Jerusalem was a tremendous. There's a whole range of goods goods that were flowing through there that were very valuable even back in the Roman days. They were still getting those. And the Crusaders, the same. Acre was probably the bigger one for the Crusaders. But look at the tax rolls. Look at what they were taxing and the goods that were coming through there, and what they were charging for services. Right, the Byzantines, as they shuttled people back and forth, they provided logistical services, and they were moving those trade goods back and forth. It's absolutely phenomenal, very dynamic, and again, routes and resources. But they use religion as kind of that motivator to get the rank and file to move along the oligarch lines, in my opinion. But again, multiple empires have done it. Multiple empires are doing it now. Multiple empires are going to still do it in the future. It's just one of those things. And the more you know about it, the more you can kind of understand a little bit about what's going on and see behind it. And it's just a fascinating history in my view. So the legend of Prester John, absolutely fascinating. And it tells you more about the world at that time, the mentality of the people of the world. And it highlights, because it tells us about the dynamics, tensions between an oligarch group, the Venetians, and the Byzantine Empire. It tells us about the Katakatai, about the exchanges of religions within a range beyond the Seljuk Turks. It tells us about the ideations of India, of imaginations of a place called China, and about the dynamism that existed in parts of the world that we tend to ignore within history, but that impacted all the way into basically Rome and the West because of what they did. And there's more history beyond that. But again, the Prester John and how those legends take legs and they inspire and they keep going. So in the 1500s, they still said somewhere in Africa, and sometimes it may be a lie, but it's a lie that motivates people, and those people will fight to get to that. And then in that, they discover a lot of truths. So there was a lot of discovery, a lot of trade networks, a lot of diplomacy that occurred because people were looking for Prester John, both in Africa and a little bit up in Asia. So hopefully that was useful. If there's any questions, we'll go over now. I don't think there's any questions. Yep, the gang said they're going to check my notes here, and then we'll be done. Okay, they're going to actually roll them up and email them, and we'll do a second one. Okay, good. So we are done. Again, if anybody has any questions on this, feel free to leave it in the comments on Substack. Probably this weekend we'll put this out over YouTube and Rumble and the other Odyssey and those others. Hopefully, if you have a topic you want to look into, feel free. If you have any more information on Prester John that we didn't cover here that you feel is useful, please comment it. We're always updating information. History is not religion; it's not set in stone. We love to talk about it. We love to debate it. We love to look at sources. And on this one, there's only 2 source documents from that. And one is actually from a secondary source, right? Hugh of Jabala in, the 1045, heard by Bishop Otto of Frisia. And he wrote about that in the Chronicles, that it was a story told to him. That's the first legend. The second one was a forged letter, obviously, that was sent to the Emperor of Constantinople and got widely reprinted and distributed everywhere. So that's it. Everything else is what people have kind of made up. So actually, there's only one source document for the legend, and it's an obvious forgery. and the motives probably aren't what we think it is. It's only to sell things, but to throw shade on the Byzantine emperor. But from that, there was so much that kind of grew on it, grew legs. And that occurs many, many, many times in history, that there will be an imagination that drives reality. And so hopefully that was useful. If anybody has any questions, feel free. Until then, be safe. Have a great weekend. Again, this was the curious case of Prester John. So thank you for listening.